Hello, class. This is Chapter 7.1a, U.S. History, the War for Independence. As an introduction to this chapter, there's a summary at the beginning, which tells a story of Valley Forge and how it went from being a unruly group of men dissatisfied with their lot to becoming a community that drew together through their suffering. At the beginning, there were about 11,000 men, including 1,000 African Americans. They gathered at Valley Forge from all parts of the country. There were also about 700 women present. Amid the suffering from wintry weather and want of food and clothing, they grew to become a band of brothers. Leaving Valley Forge 6 months later, Washington commented that he had a much stronger united army. This story illustrates how the struggle for independence helped to create a national community and identity that served as a popular democratic force, and this counterbalanced the conservatism of the America's elite leadership. The British greatly underestimated the Americans in their military capacity because they didn't have hardly any trained officers except for George Washington, and the British were very well trained. In fact, they had the best army of the time, and even more important was that they had the best navy. So they expected to win, and they expected the Americans to quickly come running back to them. The British also miscalculated the extent of the Americans' resistance. There was huge popular support for the American independence movement, and the British just believed that it was a small band of rich white conspirators who wanted to not pay as many taxes and wanted to rule instead of the British Parliament. And so they were not expecting such a huge and wide-ranged support for the American Revolution. This was actually probably a key factor in the success of the American War for Independence, because without the support of the population, the United States would not have been formed. And thirdly, the British also had difficulties with geography because those who were part of the Continental Congress were not really based in one geographic location. And to try to conquer an area was faulty reasoning, but that is the only way that the British knew how to fight a war, and so their attempts at conquering cities ended up being a failure. So they were unable to stop the revolution by just conquering cities or population centers. There were about 350,000 eligible men within the American colonies who were eligible to fight in the Patriot forces, and about 200,000 of those actually saw action, whether they were serving in the militias or in the Continental Army. Although about 25,000 of those were fighting at one time. There were also a total of about 100,000 that served in the Continental Army and about 100,000 that served in the militias, and also including 5,000 African Americans. So the big question at the beginning of the American Revolution was, could they do it with just the militia, or did they have to have a Continental Army? The appeal of the militia was that many of them had grown up with classical educations with the idealization of a citizen soldier, a man who fights defending his home and fighting with his neighbors. And they preferred to do this type of fighting because it was more idealized in their minds, and also it didn't require as much discipline as having a actual standing army. When they were fighting to defend other places in the colonies, it was not as easy to justify their fighting or their actions. But after the first defeats, General Washington was able to convince the Continental Congress that a Continental Army was essential in order to win this war against the British. And so the Continental Congress raised the support and supported a Continental Army. Congress really was afraid of forming a Continental Army for the main reason that that army could have the possibility of being used against civilians to force them to do things. And this was something that the Continental Congress was fundamentally opposed to. The Congress also decided, because of the necessity, that they would just swallow that fear and support it. And they agreed to state quotas for the Army. They also extended the terms of service from initially 1 year to 3 years, or however long the war took. And they offered bounties of land in the West to those who fought for the Continental Army, and regular wages after victory was won. So by 1777, Washington had an army of approximately 9,000 men. The casualties were horrendous for those who were in the Continental Army, because many Americans had never been exposed to this kind of horrendous close-range warfare, and especially with using cannons, that was extremely shocking. And including British barbarity, because the British were trained soldiers, and they were used to seeing this kind of carnage, and often would go through a battlefield and finish off those who had been wounded. So you would see the British with their bayonets stabbing colonists, and this was extremely shocking to the colonists. They were not prepared for this type of savage warfare. The Americans had been accused of taking scalps in their fighting, just as they had seen their Indian aggressors do towards them, but that was later proved false. There were very few civilian casualties, however. There was a formation during this time of a common identity. Although there were the colonists were extremely angry about the colonists were not necessarily sure at first on which side they would fall, but as the British Army came in and started taking food for their soldiers, that made the colonists grow angry and fall on the side of the revolutionaries. Women also were very engaged in war, either as supporters, like Mercy Otis Warren, who would use her home as a headquarters and printing shop for pamphlets. Women also took up the slack at home as their men went off to fight for the Continental Congress or in the militias, and they also went to be in the camps and to help with cooking and being launderers and seamstresses and nurses and spies. And yes, of course, you had prostitutes too. And finally, some women were so brave that they fought alongside their men. One woman, well, actually several examples of that would be Molly Pitcher, or Margaret Corbin, or Mary Hayes Macaulay, who ended up disguising herself as a man in order to be able to fight with the revolutionaries. Loyalists were often known as Tories, and this was the conservative party in England that supported the crown. So they were in America. They were also named Tories, and the Loyalists were probably between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population in the colonies. Many of the Tories or the Loyalists were newly immigrated from England. Others had a vested interest in the crown because they were either holding offices for the crown, or they were part of the Anglican Church as clergymen. Some colonies had a larger number of loyalists than others. Usually the farther south you went, the more loyalists there were. Looking at this map, it is you can see that in North and South Carolina, there were at first undecided, and later there were strong areas of loyalists that were fighting on the side of the British. The Loyalists were very persecuted by the Patriots. The colonial governments, or rather the state governments, issued bills of attainder, which were basically bills that made the Loyalists lose property or their civil rights because they were Loyalists. It was a very unfair advantage that the Patriots took against the Loyalists. They were also subject to mob violence, where, like during the Boston Tea Party, where where people were captured and tarred and feathered, and even on very rare occasions set on fire. There was also something called the Grand Tory Ride, which is where a Tory would be hauled around on a sharp fence rail around town, and those were both shamefully done against Loyalists. Loyalists were treated very badly. Their property was usually taken and auctioned off to help pay for war costs. One young man named Benedict Arnold, who was very ambitious and never really quite felt that he was rewarded or acknowledged enough for what he had done for the Patriot cause. He was early on a war hero, but in 1779 he grew really angry because he was ranked below his station, and so he became a paid informer for General Henry Clinton. He tried to betray West Point, which was at the time General Washington's headquarters, but his betrayal was uncovered largely due to his own suspicious behavior, and he fled to the British side and was given a pension and given a rank of brigadier general in the British Army. But of course the British Army didn't really trust him either, so he lived the rest of his days in England in kind of ignominy, and he was one of the most hated men in America. The British strategy was to go in and mobilize loyalists within the colonies and get them to support the British cause, but most of the loyalists fled because of persecution to England or to the British West Indies, or sometimes to Canada. The loyalists' property was confiscated by the states, and it was sold at public auction to raise money for the war effort. The British had a cunning plan, and the plan was divide and conquer. Unfortunately, it was never a success because they were never able to connect and divide the New England states from the rest of the colonies. They felt like the New England states were the problem center of the colonies, and they were trying to stop the rebellion by dividing and conquering. So General Howe was planned to march up from New York, and another army was going to march down from Canada to cut New England off from the rest of the other colonies. Yes, the plan was to go from the Halifax and cut down this direction with one army, and then to cut up from with General Howe and his troops and cut off the New England states. In early July of 1776, the British were landing about 32,000 soldiers in New York and in Boston, and so it was a very scary time for the colonists, and about 1/3 of these soldiers were actually not English at all. They were Hessian, which is a province in Germany, and they were mercenaries fighting on the side of the British. And this really scared the colonists because this made them realize that the king was did not see them as loyal subjects at all, or as his, quote, children, but as people to be subjugated. And this was what they had always feared. When there was fighting on Long Island until late August, and this is before the Continental Army had really been created, and so the American militia were found to be quite unreliable. They deserted the battlefield, and the battle ended in disaster for the Americans. The American forces had to withdraw across the East River until they got to Manhattan. 6 days later, the British invaded Manhattan, and the Americans took a stand on the Harlem Heights and prevented the total destruction of the American forces. But the British outflanked the Americans with their navy, their superior navy, and the American soldiers had to flee south. So they fled. The morale was really very low at this point, but this is where General Washington's genius showed up, because he was a man who just refused to give up. So General Washington led 2,400 troops across the Delaware River and surprised and defeated the Hessian troops that were headquartered in Trenton, New Jersey. So this battle was really very important. Well, actually, the Hessians gave up very shortly after the initial attack. They were completely taken by surprise. And this battle was very important because it raised the morale of Washington's troops. And it was at this point that Washington made kind of a realization that this was going to be a defensive war, not an offensive war for him. And he had to change his tactics to try to avoid direct confrontation with the British as much as possible. Because of defeats to the north by the troops that were coming down from Canada, the British had to rethink their cunning plan. The British general, John Burgoyne, with 8,000 men, was going to march from Canada south. And General Howe and his troops would first march up over towards Philadelphia to take out the rebel headquarters there, and then march up to meet General Burgoyne. Well, General Burgoyne, in his march south, took Fort Ticonderoga back from the Americans that had taken it originally at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, and had used those cannons on the city of Boston to get the British out of the city. But it was Burgoyne, as Burgoyne marched south, he met more and more American militiamen who fought in guerrilla warfare, and he had to retreat back to Fort Saratoga. And on October 19th of 1777, he had to surrender nearly 6,000 of his men to the Americans. This was very humiliating to him, and he was quite surprised that that they were as successful as they were. This is quite important because it was the first time that the Americans were able to offer this as an example to the European nations who were looking on, and the European nations recognized that the Americans had a fighting chance in this war for independence. General Howe, in marching up, had succeeded in capturing Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress had retreated, a hasty retreat towards Yorktown. Washington's troops were fought bravely, but were outflanked, and they experienced very heavy casualties. And there were also some miscalculations on Washington's part. So after the defeats, the American troops went into their winter headquarters at Valley Forge. They were really very dejected at this point. And there was the good news of Fort Saratoga, but it was still a difficult winter for the American soldiers.